In this demo, I'll be creating a program that utilizes the TypeState pattern. For our demo program, we'll have an employee onboarding system. So the employee will go through multiple different states to be successfully onboarded to a new job at a company. We're starting off with the employee structure. It has a name and the state. The state represents the current state of the onboarding process for the employee. The state here is actually a generic parameter, so you're not just limited to T, U, and V. You can name it anything you like. I named it state just for clarity. We then have our possible states that the onboarding process goes through. So the first thing we do is give the employee an agreement that they have to sign. Next, they sign it, and then they can transition to the training state where they begin training. If they fail the training, we'll transition to the failed training state. And if they pass the training, we'll transition to the onboarding complete state. Now, while it is possible to implement the state transitions on these structures themselves, what I'm going to be doing is implementing all of them on the employee structure using a generic constraint. So we're going to be implementing generic type states in this demo. So the first thing I'm going to do is create what's called a blanket implementation on the employee structure. So what we'll be doing is implementing for all generic employee types some specific functionality. Specifically, we need some kind of shared function between all of our states to transition into the next state. So that's what we're writing right here. So we'll just call it transition to go to the next state. And we'll make another generic parameter here called next state. And it will take self, and then we'll supply the next state that the employee should transition to. So that will get an employee, and that will be the next state. And then we'll just create a new employee, and we'll pass in the existing name and the new state. So what's happening here is we're making an implementation on the employee structure for every possible state. Since state is completely generic, whatever state we supply there, it's going to get this transition function. So when we go to implement functionality on the agreement state, for example, it's going to have this transition function available since we have the implementation block on all possible states for the employee. You'll also see that we have another generic parameter here on the transition function itself, and this represents the next state. So when we implement functionality on these states, it will supply the next state that's supposed to be transitioned to as the function parameter, and that's the next state, and that will be the new one. And as you see here, we return an employee with that generic next state. Once we start doing implementations, this should become a lot more clear. One last thing to note before we write the next implementation, you'll see here that we're taking self without a borrow, so there's no borrow here. We need to do that because that will invalidate the previous state. If we were just to borrow here, then the existing state can still remain. However, since we move self here, we get this new employee, and the old employee, whatever state it may happen to be, is not going to be accessible anymore. So the first state that we're going to implement is the state where we just have the employee read the agreement. So we'll call this one read agreement. That'll be a function that's defined on the employee when the current state is the agreement state. This read agreement function needs to take self as a function parameter, and we're going to return a new employee, and that employee will have the next state, and that next state is the signature state. So the signature state, we're just waiting for the employee to sign the document. Within our read agreement function, we'll transition into the next state. So after they read it, we'll transition, and the state will be signature. So what we're doing is we're implementing functionality for an employee when the current state is the agreement state. We create a new employee, and the initial state is agreement, where we're waiting for them to read the agreement. We have our read agreement function that can be called on the employee. And once we call that function, that means they've read the agreement. So we can then transition into the signature state, where we'll be waiting for them to sign the document. Before implementing the signature state, I'm going to hop down to the main function, and we'll start a method call chain on this whole process. So we'll just name the variable onboarded, and we'll take the employee that we have here, and we'll call the read agreement function. So right now, we have our new employee, and we can have them read the agreement. So now we'll implement the next state. The next state will be the signature state. So we'll implement the employee type, and the state will be signature. And then we'll just have a single function. It'll just be sign. So they'll sign the agreement with their signature, and we'll return a new state, and that state will be the training state. So after they sign the agreement, they'll begin training. We'll then transition into the training state, and then that's all we need to do for the signature. We can then add this to our call chain. So we can do .sign. So now the employee has read the agreement. After they read it, they're able to sign it. Since we're using TypeState transitions by using different structures as types, Rust will check this method calls here. So when we read agreements, it's going to check and see that we have a read agreement function. It's going to return a new employee, and the state is signature. If we look at our implementation block for our employee with a signature, the only thing available to do is sign it. So we can't transpose this, for example. So we can't have an onboarded employee where they sign first and then read the agreement. That won't work because if we look at the functionality for read agreements, it has to be an employee with signature. And the only function implemented is the sign function. Let's take a look at the compiler error to see what it says. So we hop into a terminal, we'll do a cargo check, and it tells us right here that the method sign is not found for employee that has the agreement state. So there's no way we can accidentally misuse this process or transition improperly. Next, we'll implement the training state. So we'll implement employee, and their state will be training. And we'll just have a train function. It'll consume self, and we'll supply a score. That way we can test out different scores. So the train function is going to return a result, and the result will indicate whether or not they passed or failed training. So we'll turn a result, and that will be an employee. We'll have an onboarding complete, and then we'll have an employee with failed training. Within our function body, we'll just check the score. And if the score is at least 7, so we'll have a 10-question quiz. If it's at least 7, we'll transition into the next state, which is onboarding complete. And we'll also include the score that they got on the quiz. And if they score under 7, then we'll return an error. And that will be failed training. I'm going to add some annotations here. That way the code doesn't get formatted. I have an auto formatter set up. This way we'll keep it all on the same screen. So with this state right here, when the employee is in training, the only option is to train. If the score that they get is greater than or equal to 7, then we're okay. We transition to the onboarding complete state. If we get under 7, then we'll get an error and we'll transition to the failed training. Both will have the score, so the score will be accessible regardless of if they passed or failed. If we head back down to our main function, after signing, we can now do training, and we'll give them a score of 6. So we'll have them fail the training at first. We'll match on onboarded, and if it's okay, that means their training's done. So we'll print out onboarding complete. And if they fail the training, we'll print out a message, training failed. We'll give them a score so they know what they scored. So to access the score, we're going to do failed, which is an employee, and then to actually change this to employee. Call it EMP for short. So we'll access the employee.state. So we're accessing the state. We take a look at our employee. We need to access this field here. So we're accessing that field because remember, this is a generic type. So it's going to be one of these structures that's listed here. So it's going to be one of these structures. At the end of that call chain, it's going to be either failed training or onboarding complete. And these states both contain a score field. So if we go back down, we'll access the state and the score just to print it out. So with this employee, we've given them a score of 6 during the training. So we should get a message that the training was failed and they have a score of 6. Let's hop back to the terminal and ensure that that's the case. And so we see that the training failed and they got a score only of 6. So let's increase their score and ensure that we get the onboarding complete if they get a 7. And so now we have onboarding complete. So just a review before we finish up the video. We have our employee, and we have a generic type here, which represents the state that the employee is in. We have an inner field, and that field is whatever state that this generic type happens to be. We create a blanket implementation on employee, and blanket implementations are when we have the generic types in all three positions. So for every single employee, for every single state, we're going to have this function available. And this transition function goes from this state into the next state. We're moving self into this function. That way we can't access the old state. So this state won't be available once we call the function. We then change the state to the next state, which is set up here as a generic parameter, and that will be placed here as the next state for the employee. Here we have all of our possible states. So these first three are the main ones, and then these are just the ending states. So they either fail or they pass. We then have implementations for the states. So for the agreement state, we read the agreement, and once they read the agreement, they're allowed to sign it. We can do that by transitioning to the signature state. When we're in the signature state, we can sign the paperwork, after which we transition to the training state. And then in the training state, we can have some training, and it returns either an onboarding complete state or a failed training state based on their score. This concludes the demo on generic type states. I'll see you in the next presentation.